NetSparker, the developers of a comprehensive automated web security platform that includes web vulnerability scanning, assessment, and management. NetSparker's desktop and cloud-based security solutions employ a unique and dead-accurate vulnerability scanning engine that automatically verifies vulnerabilities and provides a proof of concept. For more information, visit them on the web at securityweekly.com/NetSparker. Elastic Security empowers security teams everywhere to prevent, detect, and respond to threats quickly through a unified solution. And it's free and open, putting you in control. Use Elastic Security to eliminate blind spots by analyzing all of your data, no matter its volume, format, or age. Stop threats at scale with automated threat and anomaly detection, and arm every analyst with fast search and integrated case management. Download or try Elastic SIEM for free and experience the benefits of an open security solution backed by world-class security research at securityweekly.com/elastic. The biggest problem in security that remains unsolved is flat networks inside the cloud and data center that allow threats to move laterally and compromise vulnerable targets. But microsegmentation using traditional firewalls is too complex and time-consuming. There's a better approach: Edgewise Zero Trust Auto Segmentation. Edgewise is impossibly simple microsegmentation. Using the identity of machines and software that are communicating, Edgewise offers the strongest protection that adapts automatically to changes. Protect any application in any cloud without any changes to your network by visiting securityweekly.com/Edgewise. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. Make sure you join us at InfoSec World virtually June 22nd through the 24th. Security Weekly listeners save 15% off the InfoSec World Conference or World Main Conference, whatever. You get a discount code securityweekly.com/ISW 2020, because I already scrolled past it in my teleprompter. Click the register button. There's more than 80 or 90 something talks that they're uploading into their system to host the virtual conference. What I also find interesting is it's not the first time they've done a virtual conference. And I know we're still trying to figure out the whole virtual conference thing, but I have a high degree of confidence because it's not their first rodeo. And many of us here at Security Weekly will be recording presentations for them, myself included. And I will be kind of basically taking everything that I've done in the past, and especially this year, on container security and consolidating that into an hour talk. So I'm excited to release that and get that out there. Make sure you join our mailing list. Receive your invite to our community Discord server by visiting securityweekly.com/subscribe. Clicking the join button. Great stuff happening in the Discord channel. Thanks to everyone there. I know the person with the handle DMZ asked some great questions, as well as others in the channel. So make sure you join our community. We are very active in Discord, communicating with our listeners, not just us at Security Weekly, but our guests and sponsors as well. Tend to duck in there, and you can ask some questions directly. So, in the news this week, there's basically one of two stories I want to start with. One is SMB goes to SMB Bleed. The other is Universal Plug and Play. You folks pick. Which one you want to start with?
Bleed.
All right, let's go with SMB.
Yeah, we haven't had a logo in a while. Let's go with it.
That's right. and so so Dan, are you still here?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Oh, awesome. So Dan is here with us as well. Thanks for sticking around. This is kind of interesting because this is not the first time it's happened where there's a vulnerability that is disclosed, and when people start looking into the area inside of the code where that vulnerability lies, they're like, oh, hey, lo and behold, there's another vulnerability here. And so SMB Ghost was the first one. SMB Bleed was the second one. I linked to the technical details. Admittedly, I haven't looked into it much beyond that, other than like a red flag goes off in my head that SMB vulnerabilities can be really bad for basically everyone.
So, I mean, this is one they came out with an emergency fix on March 12th for, and apparently a lot of people aren't applying the fix for some strange reason. There's a workaround that you can block port 445 and SMB, and I'm thinking, how's that working out for you with everybody working from home these days?
I can't imagine a scenario where a modern enterprise is still exposing SMB. I mean, when's the last time we saw like an enterprise, right, that we would do a pen test on that SMB is exposed to the internet? I mean, it's really? Right. Is that a thing?
Like, are you saying exposed like explicitly allowed, or are you saying they don't have a outbound deny rule or outbound proxy set up correctly?
So you can reverse it. Essentially, is what you're saying, Tyler. Is you reverse the SMB connection.
Sounded like a loaded question, is what that sounded like.
Yeah, we covered that in our webcast today, like reverse shells and shoveling a shell kind of thing.
It's not the initial access point, right? Like as you're trying to get that initial execution, or you're getting some kind of code into the environment. Typically, you're doing some sort of phishing, you're using some sort of webhook, or getting some code execution within the environment, right? Once that happens, then the outbound piece, I mean, if you're trying to blend in, you're using like CloudFront or DNS or some sort of comms that's going to blend into traffic. But hey, if they're not blocking, say, a VPN directly outbound or SMB directly outbound, why not grab those hashes while you're doing recon or getting clients to open emails that you're doing recon on? So really, it's whether or not the outbound explicit rule is there by default, or if it's even been migrated as you've moved forward with different technologies.
So 445 has to be blocked inbound and egress outbound as well.
Correct.
Yeah.
Interesting. You know, a lot of providers, I remember back, so we're going the way back machine to early 2000s, right? We first had the worms running around. A lot of providers were blocking, 139 back then, 139 and 445. Is that true today or not? Or largely they kind of left it alone because, like, if they block people's crap, then people get upset.
Yeah, I think that kind of all came to fruition as like the whole what the ISP's job is as far as providing a connection to the internet, and then after that, like they're typically not doing any kind of blocking. That's kind of been the consensus over, for most providers as we've seen this move forward. I think there was a period where they thought that might be a differentiator, or that was a value add or a protection for their network and their client's network. However, they've kind of moved to the standpoint of, hey, we're providing you this link to the internet, and you're responsible for your firewall behind the cable modem. And that's pretty typical from what we've seen, at least, especially in business class.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that, Tyler, because I'm reading The Fifth Domain by Richard Clark, and there's other authors on there, right? And they're talking about that delineation between what should the government protect you from cyber threats versus what responsibility lies on you as an organization. And it's a really interesting argument. Like, the government should probably protect us from someone trying to bomb your facility with nuclear weapons, right? Like, clearly, do we need to have anti-missile, capabilities in our corporations? Like, probably not, right?
But and could we even do that, right? Like with the regulations of that, you don't want a bunch of people having anti-missiles or the ability to get a hold of them.
But when it comes to cyber weapons, that's a totally different thing, I think, for a lot of different reasons, right? And then now in the cyber realm, you throw the ISP in the mix. So, like, what should the government do to help protect us? What should ISPs do to protect us? And what are you responsible for? I think in the cyber realm, it comes down to, like, basically all bets are off. Like, you're protecting yourself, because one thing is attribution is hard, right? And knowing where your attacks are coming from, or what the attacks could be, and in what level they are, it's largely subjective, right? And a lot of investigation to figure it out. And basically that leaves you as the organization to go, you got to protect your own stuff. So has anyone looked into the SMB Bleed vulnerability specifically? Is it like an easy remote code execution thing? Or I do link to ZachOps.com, who admittedly I have not heard of before. Has anyone else heard of ZachOps? Did the original discovery and write-up, and I linked to their blog post. I'd like to get to the source, right? Because every media outlet is reporting on this thing. But I do link to the actual source of this, which contains a lot of great technical details.
So SMB Bleed, I'm not sure, but I know they just released a proof of concept for SMB Ghost. And although it tended to be unstable, that's the blueprint for creating a decent exploit. And I was trying to remember if there was something similar going on with SMB Bleed.
Yeah, and again, it says, could be exploited to remotely execute arbitrary code. I haven't seen a proof of concept, although one could exist.
Yeah. Oh, there
I've been
it
waiting
is.
to see a proof of concept out there. I heard there was a couple that got released, but I've not actually had the time to look for the code.
There's an exploit for both of them. It's actually in Paul's article. SMB Ghost and SMBleed RCE POC from ZecOps.
Yeah, and that's a screenshot movie, basically, right?
Yeah.
Which,
well,
it's one level. It's
I'm
one.
shocked.
I mean, and I don't want to just discount it because there is that, right? But like Tyler said,
No.
I haven't seen the code and been able to, actually try it out on my own. And those are two different things, right? Under controlled conditions, you can create a great screenshot movie that shows it. And I'm not saying they're faking the screenshot movie, but again, under controlled conditions, I think really the advice is with these things that come out that say could be remotely exploitable and it involves SMB, like really just start rolling out the patch. Like to be quite honest, like, yeah, there might be repercussions from rolling out the patch, but I mean, just roll out the patch because it could be the next WannaCry, it could not be, but like, you're going to hedge your bets on that? Like this is a potentially really bad situation, in my opinion.
One of the funny things on this one is that, they talk about the Windows versions that are vulnerable, 1903 and 1909. And why aren't the previous versions vulnerable? Because there was a bug that caused them to not be vulnerable. But they fixed the bug, so then they became vulnerable.
That's just like software, right? Like that's just the way it works, right? Yeah, no, it is a very interesting point, Lee, that you bring up.
I mean, you get the bug put together Friday night, you go home, you come back on Monday, and it's like, damn it, it's Sisyphus all over again.
Mm-hmm. I thought the universal plug and play thing was really, really kind of interesting. It got me where I went with this was I want to know what my exposures are. Like what do I have running that's universal plug and play? And to me the takeaway from this one was really, if you do want to know that, I linked to a great article that shows you how to use Nmap, shows you how to use Miranda. Miranda's an older Python script that shows you all the universal plug and play devices on your network. I thought this was kind of interesting because you might be sitting there going, I don't have universal plug and play on my network, right? But you'd be, I think, shocked. Even in enterprise, you run this on your network, the amount of things that show even potential to have universal plug and play. Now, admittedly, some of the things on there that these scripts, including the, what did they call it? It was, what is this attack called? Hold on. Call Stranger, thank you.
Yeah.
And they have a whole website dedicated to it, and a whole GitHub repo. So there's the Call Stranger code. There's the Nmap script that you can run to find universal plug and play, and then there's also Miranda. All three of those tools found like different stuff on my network, and I thought it was kind of interesting that some of the things, maybe the endpoint was available where you could hit a certain port over HTTP and access, slash UPnP, and basically it was a 404 because I turned off universal plug and play on some devices. Other things did spit back an XML file, like a Roku device that wasn't accessible. I just think there's so much attack surface with universal plug and play. I was trying to describe earlier to Johnny like what universal plug and play was. I'm like, essentially it lets devices talk to each other about what they can do and then like do stuff with it without authentication, which I'm like, just verbalizing that makes it sound like it's really bad. I'm like, actually it is kind of bad and we should not be running universal plug and play. It's just a horrible protocol security wise. And so the examples are with a firewall, right? And so this very much exists today. You stand up a firewall. It says basically nothing from the internet can get to my stuff. And then that firewall supports universal plug and play. I fire up devices on my network. Those devices say, hey, like for me to be useful, you need to open up firewall ports, but we want to make that easy for you. So guess what? I'm just going to talk to your firewall. again, without authentication, and I'm going to tell your firewall to open up all of these rules and expose me to the internet, and then I work with no security controls whatsoever. How did this protocol even come into existence? It's mind-boggling to me.
Well, if you remember back to the times of the DEC Alpha, right? Way back in the day, there really was no way for you to be able to just plug something in and have it work, right?
Yeah, it's true.
So UPnP came about to solve that problem, right? And at the time, it was light speed, an advancement for how devices connect together. So
yeah, right, Scott, because the other example is like
network devices. They never said, well, somebody's going to be able to take this over and maliciously use it, right? No one would ever do that, Telnet.
Yeah.
So that's in my own humble opinion, that's how it came about.
It's very much, Scott, to your point, a usability thing. I want to make it usable. And the other kind of example I gave is I've got this device that can display stuff and play videos. I've got this other device that has content and can stream that, and they can just magically talk and be able to all of a sudden like play videos, right? Stream videos from one device to another. My TV, my Roku says I can play stuff. My Plex server or NAS thing can say, hey, I've got the content. Like, rather than, to your point, Scott, having an engineer or sysadmin go in and like configure that stuff, they talk and magically it works. And then we shouldn't wonder why there's security vulnerabilities.
Well, I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off here.
That's okay.
However, you look at how that type of communication is done nowadays, and it's usually an app that can be secured that's using it. I'll give you an example, right? I've got a 43-inch here, 227s, and an iPad Pro that all display Windows, right? And between the Windows machine and the iPad Pro, I'm using a program called Duet, right?
Yeah, I've heard of Duet before.
So now my iPad Pro is a touchscreen for it, right? But it's the extension of usability between devices that really needs to be looked at, right? A while ago, we thought it would be just on, it was everything was secure, and then automobiles, airplanes went sideways, cruise ships are being veered off course, and now we're taking over something that was built for usability way back in the day that nobody had ever really looked at.
And it's interesting, the Ars Technica article, I think, just scratches the surface, right? It says the 12-year-old Universal Plug-and-Play protocol simplifies the task of connecting devices by allowing them to automatically find each other over the network. It extends beyond that. It's not just finding each other, but taking actions on those devices, where I really think the kind of second level of security vulnerabilities exist. What I find interesting, and Dan, I know you're out there, right? We talked about finding assets, finding vulnerabilities. I want to know what devices are talking Universal Plug and Play, and what they're advertising, what other devices they're discovering. It's interesting, by querying multicast and broadcast via Universal Plug and Play, you can find all that stuff without scanning every single device on my network for some UDP port, which, as we know as engineers, takes a really long time. And this information appears. I want to know about that. That's a great way to discover it as a pen tester or as a blue team going, what's on my network, right?
Sure. Yeah. No, and I'm sorry, I missed part of the discussion around how to discover it, but it is amazing that UPnP is still around. I mean, I get the original use case for it, and it's kind of like your classic, hey, we've solved a problem and then created a million others. But being able to identify those and shut them down is something that you would definitely want. I mean, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, guys. I mean, I think that the intent was more on from the home network perspective and the home device, and things like printers and things, and wanting to make sure that you could just immediately start printing, and so it cascaded into all these other devices that now have their way in the enterprise.
Make that more than 81 million devices visible on the internet.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you a question, Paul. How long has Security Weekly been on air?
This year will be 15 years in October.
So Security Weekly is older than Plug and Play, right?
Yeah, and in 2007, Larry and I wrote the book on WRT54G routers, which at the time even before that, supported universal plug and play. And Larry and I both looked at that protocol, and we kind of looked at each other. We're like, this is a recipe for disaster. And there's been a series. I mean, this is just the latest incarnation of basically universal plug and play vulnerabilities. And a lot of these articles are actually doing a good job of talking about some of the history, because it's not the first time there's been a vulnerability in this protocol. I think the inherent vulnerability is the lack of authentication, right? To make things usable, they've basically removed any type of authentication or authorization from this process. And that, to me, is what makes things really interesting from an attacker perspective. Couple that with the ability to use it for denial of service. In the exploit code that was released, one of the things it can do, and I'm not quite sure on all the technical details. I started looking through the code earlier and ran out of time, but there is a denial of service component to this as well.
Mm-hmm. So in the Discord chat, was somebody's making a comment, if we're not careful, it'll give people the ideas, and the next thing we know, someone will put a storage device on the network. Hell, they might even put lightweight switches on the network. We already see this in the security world, right? How many times have you heard of a story where somebody's dropped off a handful of USBs and, in a parking lot and gotten them plugged in, or a physical penetration tester dropping something on a network and waiting to see how long it would take people to find it, right? The fact that we're dealing with an antiquated method of dealing with these issues, right, is really, really bad. And it's not just plug and play. I'm sure that there are others out there that are not being done in a secure manner, right? There's no way to wrap a container around them like we did between Telnet and SSH, right? So how do we find those? How do we address those? And then how do we get the word out that, hey, we've got a new protocol, right? Does anybody really have the time to go after it?
And one of the things that just astonishes me, right, is part of this protocol is UDP, which means you can spoof things, and that's how the denial of service condition is created. You basically, spoof the address of a third-party site on the internet. When the attack is performed, the callbacks are basically sent to all of the other devices, right? Because UDP is it goes back to like TCP/IP fundamentals to create the denial of service condition. Just astonishing. In my article, I do link to I do like the website I link to, because I the next logical question as you hear us talk about this is asking the question, what's on my network that speaks universal plug and play? There's a great example of an nmap command there, and Kali Linux includes Miranda. I downloaded Miranda. It's an older version of Python. I believe it's Python 2. It ran fine when I ran it on my box as well, to find all of those UPnP devices on your network. And again, this is a finding on an enterprise network, like just shut it down, right? Like the attack vectors, I don't think are going to stop because of just the fundamental lack of security inside of this protocol that we identified all the way back 2007 and even before that. And you will have devices on. I challenge anyone to go scan their network, home or enterprise, and not find anything that's running universal plug and play on your network, right? Like, I think this is something that's on everyone's network. Also a great way for pen testers. This is one thing that Carlos Perez and I talked about a long time ago. Rather than scanning the entire network and making a lot of noise, querying multicast and broadcast services to send out a discovery request to find devices on your network. I was amazed as I ran this, even on our small network here, how many devices reported back in just allowing me to do that discovery and exfiltration of data by not scanning the entire network, right? Because it relies on multicast and broadcast traffic, which is still valid today.
Jeez.
Anyone else want to weigh in on the universal plug and play?
Well, I'm sitting here trying to run scans and see what I find.
Right.
I'm like, well, down the rabbit hole.
What about IPP?
Yeah, similar
right?
kind of thing. Yeah, Also speaks
and
to
that's the printing protocol.
SSDP, right? Service. Just it's not actually the word something, but something service discovery protocol is like the same kind of thing, right? All of these things will basically leak data about what's on your network, not just like where it is that it exists, but other metadata about that device I can pinpoint. Like I found that there was the TV connected to our network that plays the program feed when we do a show, also has Roku installed on it as well. I don't know if that's an external device or built into the TV, but there's a Roku service that's built on it.
Yeah, but TVs are a whole other show.
Yeah.
Yeah, you'd be surprised what leaks on not only corporate networks, but your home personal network. That's what that tool that Corey wrote, Packet Recon. It just passively sniffs, and you can get domain, you get usernames, you get SMB versions, you can have entire IP stacks, all leaked VLANs, leaked from just broadcast data. So there's a ton of information that is available and then can be abused once you know it.
Yeah, and I guess my point is like attackers may do that, but you should do that as a defender. Use the same techniques to discover what's on your network, and then take action. And Dan, I guess that's what plays into like BleckStack, right? Like my next script I want to write is something that queries all this stuff, running the tool that Corey wrote, all their scans, discovering what's on my network, discovering the services that they're running that may go above and beyond what a scanner may be configured to find because it's UDP, and scanning every single host on my network on every single UDP port would take forever, but just sending one packet to, a broadcast address gives me all this information that I funnel back and I put that into my inventory scan. Do you have any customers doing that, Dan?
I couldn't speak to that specifically, but I do know that like it really begs the question and in the importance of having a proactive mindset, because like not just relying on, hey, my scanner is always going to just find these things, but really saying like, hey, like what we all just did, like we're all like, how do I discover this on my own network? So like I should be doing that on a daily basis and saying like, I can't just trust that my, whatever tools I'm using are always going to pick these things up. And that's kind of being that, having some foresight and even planning out like, hey, here's the tactics that we want to start testing and making sure as these things come out, we can, adapt and identify them and bring them back into our system.
And some of these IoT devices are really sneaky. They may not listen on any TCP ports, right? It may elude some of your scans, but they're listening on UDP and they're listening for those multicast and or broadcast queries. Right.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. I guess most vulnerability scanners, they're going to report, they're going to have like an agent where they're logging in or something, right? So I mean, would they necessarily identify like open UDP ports, right? From that perspective,
my experience, Dan, having worked in the industry, is like some UDP ports might be queried by default, maybe. To really turn on any other UDP scanning because it has a significant performance impact is an exercise left to the user, and almost no solutions that I ever tested would scan for every UDP port, right? And we've talked about this in a PCI context, Jeff, right? Like, what is my responsibility to scan for open ports, right? And how do we differentiate TCP versus UDP? And I forget what PCI says. Do they make a delineation between the two?
No, they don't. They just use the word comprehensive.
Yeah.
and that's left to the interpretation. I mean, when I used to argue with Renault about it back at Tenable and team, I should say, I think we landed on for the ASV scans, for the external scans, we would do the exhaustive T space, but for the UDP, it was maybe 20 or 25 common
like not
ports.
A lot.
It had to be very
not
targeted.
Many at all.
Right?
I mean, I don't think a scanner could exhaust. I mean, I don't know how long you run it, because what's the default timeout on a UDP, or I guess you could, I guess it depends on scanner by scanner, but 65,000 times, however you're letting the scan run.
I know, and I feel like
you never
any kind of a response.
I feel like I should know this because Well,
30 seconds.
When you
I
scan,
think the default's more like 60 or 90.
When you scan for UDP, though, it's an ICMP.
But there's no response.
But it's an ICMP response that would come back. Again, that's application specific and based on network filtering. If I'm allowing ICMP responses out from my network, and which type of ICMP response am I allowing out? Most firewalls would, for example, allow the ICMP type of, a ping response to come out, but not allow the specific ICMP response that's for a UDP, which, oh God, I should know this I used to know this off the top of my head, what all the different ICMP types were and what it was that was for a UDP port. I'm not listening on that UDP port. There is a specific ICMP type that it gets sent in response, but it could also be that the network, whether that's your network or your ISP's network, that could be filtering that, to kind of go back to our previous conversation about blocking port 445. And this comes into play in traceroute, right? When you run traceroute, it not completely accurate based on who might be filtering which ICMP types, right? Which this Joff would probably know this off the top of his head.
Well, it kind of comes back, like where my head was going is like, yeah, you don't want to scan on a dynamic perspective all the UDP ports on a system. That's never going to work. But like having an agent that actually just lists all the opening or the listening UDP connections, running a netstat command or whatever, seems like the way to go, at least to identify, so that you know what kind of common UDP ports to be looking for if you want to do a dynamic scan to see what's actually listening on it, would be my thought.
I want to say it was type 11 in the ICMP codes, which is time exceeded, right? Which is
time expired in transit.
Also, time expired in transit, is another one. Which one is that one? Time expired in transit. I don't remember.
That's the 0-bit on 11.
Yeah. Yes. So there's types in code, right? Type 0 is an echo reply. Type 11 is the time exceeded. Yeah. Nerdy TCP/IP stuff.
Down we go.
Down we go. Down.
Hey! Look at the bright side. At least you're getting a response. Okay, that was a bad joke.
Whoa.
Greg, honey.
Never mind. What? You don't like UDP?
I was quoting a movie, and I'm not finishing the quote.
So, you want to talk about PCI?
Yeah, let's do it. PCI.
Let's do it.
3 common misconceptions. Yeah. So my story number 6 was titled 3 Common Misconceptions About PCI Compliance. This was from HelpNet Security. A great source. I'll just throw that out there. And by no means are we knocking the source. And what was interesting was misconception 1 and misconception 2. And again, Jeff, we talked about the nuances in PCI, right? And I thought they were very close. So misconception 1 is that you believe a certain product or system is out of PCI scope. Misconception 2, you've accurately scoped your CDE. And what was CDE?
Card data
CDE
environment.
is cardholder data environment.
Yeah, yes. But aren't those the same kind of thing, or?
Well, actually, no. And let me provide a caveat. The person that is the author of the article actually works for a company that, because he describes himself as the PCI guy. Mm-hmm. He works for a company that's a service provider company, and basically they're providing solutions to merchant customers. So they're the middleman. That more times than not, the context that he's looking at is, they're going after their customers that are merchants, and the merchants want to do as little as possible, and they're trying to take as much off their hands as possible. So
he's a QSV? Qualified scanning?
He's not a QSA. He's their company is listed as a service provider company. Mm-hmm. Visa maintains a website, a listing of known service providers that you have to pay a fee to get listed, and you're responsible for reporting your compliance. So they're listed as a merchant servicer,
and that's different from a QSV, which is a qualified scanning vendor. Is that?
Well, you're mixing your metaphors. There's a QSA, which is a qualified security assessor company. That's where I work. And
you were a former QS. You are.
I'm a former QSA.
Former QSA. Right.
I'm a former QSA. I'm not qualified to be a QSA anymore because I don't hold certain certifications.
Right.
And I refuse to. But that's another story.
Okay. But there's a
and then there's an ASV, which is an approved scanning vendor, which is what Tenable was.
Right.
And then but the company that this guy works for is basically, they're a company that's going out and their customers are merchants that have to do PCI, and they're providing them with the cash registers, the point of sale solutions, the payment devices. They're whoever's supplying all this stuff for the cigar shop next door. That's a merchant servicer. Okay?
And so a merchant servicer, are they the developers of the point of sale systems, or are they more like a reseller kind of consultant that
typically, they can be both, but typically they're a reseller.
Yeah. There's a company that makes the point of sale systems and the software and procures the hardware. And then there's a middle person, which is a reseller, which is taking that stuff and reselling it and providing some consulting services to merchants.
Right.
Okay.
One of the biggest, and I don't know if they technically fall under this category or not, but they're roughly equivalent. First Data Corporation.
Yeah. Okay.
They do merchant services, and they provide. They actually develop a lot of the products as well. Heartland Payment Systems, I believe they also offer solutions. So anyway,
and so are some of those? Sorry, Jeff. Hold on. Are some of those resellers of point of sale systems also an ASV and can help you with your PCI certification?
So they could be. They don't have to be. Very often, they would just partner with some other company that's already an ASV,
right? Like a Rapid7 or a Qualys or a Tenable, right? Yeah, they're all ASVs, right? Yeah.
Yep. So, but what they're doing, beyond just supplying all the devices, all the cash registers, payment systems, is they're doing the setup. They're taking a lot of the responsibility for the security of it, the PCI compliance, if you will.
Right.
Not necessarily always. There's still stuff that the merchant's on the hook for,
are responsible for. Yep.
And because they're doing it doesn't mean they're absolving the merchant of the liability if something goes wrong. That's a different story again. But I wanted to make the distinction just because from where this guy is sitting, where he's not the merchant that's having to be PCI compliant. He's selling and attempting to sell PCI compliant solutions to merchants. There is a distinction between, your point of sale system. Well. All right, let me back. There's a difference between the point of sale system, the cash register, and think of a typical department store where there might be an ATM machine at the front of the store and maybe a lottery machine, a lottery purchasing machine, or in the recent past there might be a red box, selling DVDs. And it's a grocery store, so there's also a bakery and a florist and so on and so forth. All sorts of different things that might be residing on the same network. This store's got video surveillance, and that's on the same network. They've got, they're managing it using Active Directory or whatever else. They've got security tools in place to do monitoring. They've got.
Well, and it's interesting, Jeff, right? Like they've got a time clock system. They've got maybe a system that helps them with the inventory if they're a bar with their booze, right, which could be a separate software from their food management. Yeah, it's amazing how the amount of technology that can exist in one particular retailer, right? Yeah.
Right. And if it's all on the same flat network, and that network also has the point of sale systems, guess what? They're all part of the cardholder data environment.
Right.
But a lot of companies and organizations, they don't understand that. or they think, well, it's on a different VLAN, so it's segmented out, right?
It's on a different VLAN, but we can route to each other, and there's no rules that restrict the access between VLAN. Yeah, okay.
So, but you're the merchant, and you think, well, all I care about is the cash registers, the point of sale systems, not all the other stuff. But all the other stuff, if it's on the same network, it's all possible attack vectors. There's pivoting that could go on. They could be the source. Take Target, for example. The HVAC is how the bad guys get in. Who thought, who would have thought about the HVAC? So that's where this guy's making the distinction between his misconception number one being thinking that something's in scope for PCI, and PCI scope is tricky because there's two aspects to it, and people I work with don't necessarily get this all the time. It's a common misconception, and it's somewhat archaic, but in the early days of PCI, it was, okay, you're an organization, we assume you have a flat network, everything's in scope, follow these security requirements. And there has always been the opportunity to this day, if you want to isolate your card data environment, away from the rest of your network and do segmentation, that's perfectly acceptable. It's not a requirement, but it's effectively a requirement in that you're trying to isolate your most sensitive, at least from a payment card perspective, most sensitive systems. So the first aspect of scope is what in my network, what in my environment is subject to these security rules. That's the one way of looking at scope. The other way of looking at scope is which of these PCI requirements applies to this particular system or this particular network or this particular device. In theory, they all apply, but logic will kick in at some point and say, if the requirement is for antivirus or anti-malware, and you've got some kind of weird device that doesn't really have any kind of commercial offering available. Right. In the old days, it was Apple products, but with given all the different things that are out there, appliances and stuff like that, it's very possible that that requirement just may not apply. So there's the scope of which requirements apply to what you have as part of your card data environment. But there's also until you prove otherwise, your entire network is subject to all the PCI requirements until you isolate and create and prove a card data environment.
Yeah. What I love about this, Jeff, is that you and I had conversations about this recently, basically helping out our neighbors, right? A retailer, a cigar shop that we help out. And I brought up some interesting, what I thought were interesting questions that there's not like a straightforward answer. And I'm like, shouldn't there be? But there isn't, because it's very nuanced. In one of my questions to this point, and you're basically making a case this article is actually pretty good in differentiating these two things. And my question was, well, what if I separate the point of sale systems from the rest of the network? And can I do that by just enabling the Windows firewall? Or is that just a requirement that if it's a Windows system, the firewall should be enabled anyway, and I need to take additional steps to further segment the network beyond the Windows firewall? Because I may have multiple point-of-sale systems. They all have the Windows firewall on them. Then I'm using VLANing or physical segmentation to segment that from the time clocks, from the bar management system, from the camera network system, or whatever the case may be, right?
Right. But let's put it in tenable terms, which you can understand. What if you've deployed Security Center and you've got some number of Nessus scanners deployed in your network, some within your point of sale environment, some's over at your inventory system, some's over at your, I'm thinking more of a office operation, some's over at the desktop area. But you got one single management console that's touching all of those appliances that are out there, including the one that's in your isolated segmented zone. Does that put the Security Center console in scope? There's not a clear answer. I mean,
it's interesting.
There's a lot of different opinions on that. Or Active Directory, your domain server. Do you need to have a separate domain server for inside your environment as well as outside, or can you manage the domain, cross boundaries from one or more?
And what's amazing to me, Jeff, we were talking about a small retailer, right? But now extrapolate that to, and I'll use Home Depot as an example, right? Only because my recent, experience with Home Depot was very positive, but made me think about some of these issues. So, in the studio here,
I'm getting a tear in my eye again, Paul.
Right? Like
you walk into a store now and you're seeing PCI.
I'm seeing PCI so here's the scenario. I'm working on some HVAC issues, which is interesting when we talk about HVAC vendors, right? Trying to fix the heating and cooling in the studio, make sure in the summer months our server room is cool. And so I wanted to relocate a thermostat. And so I'm like, well, now in the times of COVID-19, like I don't want to walk into a store, just for a lot of reasons, right? Because I don't want to expose anyone that doesn't need to be exposed or whatever, right? So it's just me being a good citizen, don't want to go into a store, don't want to expose myself either, right? But also, I don't want to order from an online retailer because I'm going to pick on Amazon a little bit. The shipping times are just like so random, and it could be you get it right away, or it could be there's a week or more that you don't get that stuff. So I went to Home Depot and I placed this pickup order, and I was like, oh, that's great, and my order was ready. And the Home Depot for us is like literally you could throw a rock and hit it from the studio. It's right around the corner. They said, well, look, it's in a locker, and here's your code and your QR code and your so there's a digit, a 5 or 6 pin number and a QR code. And they're like, come to the store. They're like, you can go into the store, you can scan your QR code and or enter this 5 or 6 digit code, and that will open up a corresponding locker. You can take your stuff and you can leave. I'm like, yeah, like in times of COVID-19, I'm like, that's pretty cool. And so I did that. And now customer experience, I was like, that's really cool. Security persons, I'm like, hold on. Like this thing's probably connected to the network, right? It's probably some kind of IoT device, which red flag is probably vulnerable. It's probably connected to some network somewhere because it's got to receive updates, right? And then I'm starting to think like, well, in terms of fraud, what does that mean if I can brute force PIN numbers or whatever? And then I'm like, how does this all play into PCI? Because I paid for this stuff. My credit card number was involved, and that's a different system. I thought that was kind of an interesting take on it. But then you extrapolate all this out into a place like Home Depot, one of the largest retailers in the country. And I'm like, oh my God, like them dealing with PCI. I'm like, that's just like teams of people. I'm like, that's a pretty amazing feat.
Well, and somebody's making this point on our Discord server, and I agree with them. When you work at these companies, Home Depot said, what we care about security for, and paraphrase, hammers. I used to hear that all the time. These are not companies that are financial institutions, banks, insurance companies that have been regulated and having to do security, since the very beginning.
These are right. And thermostat wire and wire nuts and electrical tape, right? That's what I was ordering.
Right, but somebody came in and said, hey, if you attach to the internet and use it as your back end, you can save all sorts of money and do all sorts of great, make more money, earn more revenue, and use this internet thing. And they just, nobody ever told them, oh, by the way, there's a cost to that. And because there's security concerns that nobody in your company, and I'm generalizing, of course, but most of these companies, security is not part of their culture. It's not part of their DNA, and this is why I hammer home PCI all the time. The only reason they're doing security is because PCI makes them do it, no more, no less. And if nobody's there to explain it to them, they're missing the boat. They miss the boat anyway.
Right.
But it's nuanced, but for us as security professionals, and I tweeted this out yesterday or the day before, there's only 6 things you need to do for PCI: secure your network, secure the data, keep it secure, control access, do all the security stuff, and everything you do, write it down. That's the essentials of PCI. So anyway,
Tyler,
I mean,
have you seen these devices at Home Depot?
Yes.
And did you probably had the same thoughts I'm like, this is a hacking opportunity potentially, right? Because like I scan this QR code, magically a locker opens up and I get my stuff, and I've already paid. I'm like, wow, that's.
I mean, this isn't the only thing that's been using this, though, right? Like, I've seen these kind of things, and I've thought this is a very interesting. Like, there's got to be a backend database tied to all these that is going across probably a cellular network. Propane tanks, I think, were some of the first. They had those cell phone charging stations that you do the same thing with, which seems even worse. Like, that sounds so scary. But all of these devices have to have some kind of authentication mechanism and backend database, maybe even if it's local. That means there's something there that could either be abused, and that could be as simple as scanning a malicious QR code that has like a SQL injection flaw, or something that outputs data to the screen, does a buffer overflow. Like, there's a ton of attack methods here that seem like would be
like,
a lot
how
of fun
cool
to
would
play
it
with,
be,
but I would
Tyler?
never do that.
I want to do a video of like us walking up to the thing at Home Depot and like all the lockers open up. Like, that would be just so sensational, right?
And
Only if you put a tennis ball up to the lock
Let's do
mechanism.
that at the Pocatello Home Depot, not over here.
Yeah, right. Like, that would be really cool.
Yeah, there's a lot of
final thought on this article. It wasn't really that good because it was from the perspective of the middleman. It's not from the perspective of the real retailer.
Oh, the retailer. Yeah, no, agreed.
Those are not the three misconceptions that I would pick.
Oh, okay. Yep.
So.
Agreed.
How about Lovebug?
Lovebug. Let's talk about Lovebug.
So, Lovebug came out 20 years ago this month.
Hold on. What is explain Lovebug?
The Lovebug was one of the first effective ransomwares. There was a previous one to that called, let me remember here, the AIDS Trojan.
Yeah,
which would basically have you mail a check to a guy.
Ran Levy does the podcast Malicious Life. Also Graham Cluley. Those are two people we interviewed that went back in history to basically ransomware, right?
Yeah.
So Lovebug was one of the first ones.
Right, and it was to me. When I was reading up on it, it seemed like it was the first one that actually kind of worked the way they do now, and changed the landscape of malware from just doing a little bit of malfeasance to frickin' encrypting your stuff and sending you a bill to get it back. And it wasn't intended to do that. It was supposed to just be a credential harvesting thing, but like many things that have gotten out, they've become more interesting in the wild. And I just thought it was really interesting, where it started in the Philippines, from a guy in the Philippines, and just raised the bar. And look at all the energy we spend today related to ransomware and how far it's come. And it was 2000 that this started. This isn't recent. I thought ransomware was a lot younger than that.
Yeah, no, it has roots going back even farther than that.
And so I just thought it was kind of fun and interesting to see what people thought about the history of our one of our favorite incidents these days.
Well, and what's interesting is, I saw another article, and I don't think I added it to the show notes. That was like, do you pay ransomware or not? What I find it kind of interesting is the double dipping that you could do in ransomware, in that if you're going to encrypt the data at a company, it means you have access to it, which means you can read it first, create a copy of it, and then encrypt it, and then ransomware the company to get it back. But I still have a copy of it that I can then monetize to either, if the person isn't going to pay the ransomware, bribe them with leaking that information publicly, or collect the ransom, then go sell that data. Because I'm a criminal, I have no ethics or morals, so I'm going to go sell that data to someone else as well. So there's that kind of double dipping aspect of ransomware. And then we think about ransomware as more of a disruptive attack But now put your tinfoil hat on. How much of this ransomware, where people have either paid it out or they're monetizing it because they've stolen the data and then encrypted it, doesn't matter if you pay or not, right? There have been cases where, Baltimore's the example where, they make them an offer and they're like, no, I don't want that. Could it be that they already have their data and they're monetizing it? Where is that money going? Is it going to fund these other groups in other countries? Tyler's laughing because he wears 2 tinfoil hats. I think I have one. Tyler, I think one-ups me on tinfoil hats, right? Is this money being used to fund enemy nation states in this example, maybe to the U.S.? Mm-hmm. Tyler, do you want to weigh in?
I mean, honestly, we have to be real. This is, if you're a criminal and you are trying to fund and front money that are long-term engagements, and or maybe double dip because you're a contractor or a board hacker, or one of these hacker groups, this seems like a good way to do it. If all of these groups fail in very similar ways, and you're doing this at the nation level, kind of, you've got that kind of talent and skill, you're not going to make a lot of those same mistakes. And so, why not create something that's going to monetarily give you the advantage, provide some funding for your operations, and is more or less not really attributable. So,
right. But what's interesting, Tyler, I mean, let's think about budget though, right? I mean, look at North Korea, look at China, look at Iran. Look at the budgets those governments have to put into cyber hacking, cybersecurity, offense or defense, right? I mean, does making a few $100,000 on a ransomware attack, does that really hit their budget, right? Does that cover their AWS computing bill so they can stand? I mean, I know what my AWS computing bill is for what we run, right? It's negligible compared to what they could take from a ransomware attack. But is it negligible to what the Iranian government can fund them? Is it really an issue or not? I don't know.
Really, there's 2 points there, right? You do have to realize that, nation states do have the ability and capacity to operate at a higher level than a lot of places do, but they are still under a time constraint for a specific mission. They're still under a budget constraint for whatever they're doing. There's not an unlimited budget, right. No matter anybody says. There's other priorities and prerogatives that governments have.
Also, keeping it off the books, right? You want to keep some of that stuff off the books, right? Yeah.
And some of that off the books money is very, very hard to come by and find and or hide or allocate, right? You can't just make things disappear in government all the time. I mean, they have ways, but more or less this provides an avenue to do that. But take that one step further and think about what's to say that these ransomware attackers or, ransomware as a service are not leveraging other criminals that are using this ransomware as a service and going through the files that they're ransoming before they do that. What if they have keyword searches within inside of this ransomware? What if they're pulling back files looking for particular highlights within inside of each of these networks? Or if they gain access via one of these networks by a ransomware as a service or someone using their service and they want access into that, what's to say they're not using that as a vector or an avenue to then lay down some good persistence?
Yeah, was it Dooku or Flame that was grabbing the first so many bytes of every file, sending that back for analysis, and then going back and just pulling selective files, right? I forget which one it was or both,
and that's,
right?
I mean, how many years old is that? Look at some of the file handle API capabilities within inside of Windows and the Windows telemetry data. You can do a lot of this very quick in a very small footprint. And ransomware is getting fairly sophisticated, such that this isn't hard code to embed and build analysis around, especially with some of the ML stuff being done against files for, say, DLP or for classifications of data. Well, this is how you protect your data, and this is good things to do. This also provides mechanisms and programs and code that can do this in a nefarious fashion. What if that is looking for a particular tag or classification or header on each one of these data files? That's something that is easy to code, and there's plenty of ongoing projects and programs that do that already.
I wanted to transition to security drift, the silent killer. To me, it's not so silent sometimes. I guess you're a victim, right? It's not so silent. And so some of the examples they give to support their title of Security Drift the Silent Killer is a high-tech company had a robust, or so they thought, AV solution allowed for a 3-week patch drift for 2% of its systems. Some of the systems required testing before patching. Others were delayed due to operational constraints. This is most enterprises today. The company was hit by a worm propagated to almost all unpatched systems, which represented 3,000 machines. I think it's interesting to talk about security as a drift, right? Is we make exceptions that there is this kind of drift in security.
I haven't read the article. Does it actually define drift, or is it just assume we all have an idea what we're talking about?
It does not really define. So a new form of drift
because drift is drift's kind of an engineering networking type of term, right?
Yeah, I kind of think of, is it DriftNet? Is that the one that lets you look at images or something coming through the network? Is that DriftNet?
Yeah.
I couldn't help thinking when you first introduced this, in cyber, nobody can hear you scream.
Right. Drift could also be that I think I'm applying the patch, but there are conditions where that patch isn't truly effective, right? System hasn't been rebooted. There's multiple versions of that software and or DLL files on the system. I patch one, but not the other. There's kind of all those little drift essentially being the gap into what you fixed, what you think you fixed versus what is actually fixed would be my definition. And that's what often bites us, right? I mean, that's what we prey upon as pen testers, right? Drift is that one system that provided by a vendor hasn't been fixed, and that's our foothold, right?
That is typical when you start to see really, like, outside of the ones that are not mature, when you start to see really, really mature organizations that are doing all of the fundamentals right, they're getting all of the big pieces right, they've got good visibility in the network. One of the things that we end up having to look for as offensive or pen testers is really that creative edge, but this concept of drift, or the things that are kind of outside of norm and get forgotten. Like almost all of the really secure networks I've had to tackle, their only straw that ended up breaking the camel's back was usually one system, and there sometimes was a legitimate reason, sometimes it was just a forgotten system. It was decommissioned, it was set to power off, and it was powered off, but it was left plugged in and it had an auto power on after, a power outage or something. Mm-hmm. So these are things that commonly happen, and it only takes one for a good organization to have that used against them. And so it is a real concept. I'm not sure I've heard it called drift, but that is a reality.
I mean, and I struggle with this. I mean, does it come down to like the defenders have to be right all the time and the attackers don't have? I don't really buy into that, but that's essentially what we're saying, is that defenders miss one thing and it could be a bad day. If the attackers miss one thing, they move on to the next thing. Or is that oversimplification really is the flaw in that logic?
If you say it like that, that kind of does make sense, and that is true. However, like, in order for the attacker to get to the point where they only have to be right once, like, they're looking at a huge network. They have to understand pretty much everybody's network, all the technologies, all the underlying technologies. They have to be able to understand how admins deploy them, what mistakes are being made for each one of those. So yeah, we only have to find that one, but that's because we know so much about so many different things, and that is such a wide breadth for us to cover that it's not really fair to say we only have to be right once. It makes it seem easy. It's not always easy. There are ways that we have to really understand the very, very deep fundamentals of a product, a technology, a protocol, in order to figure out how it's implemented and then how to break it on top of that. We have to use our brain and get very creative around what we could do to actually break this. So yeah, we do only have to be
the question, Tyler. What can organizations do to make information gathering more difficult, right? Like, I always come back to the example of, I'm a sysadmin, I go in a forum and I ask a question, and that's leaking information about my organization as just one example. What can organizations do to kind control that information leakage to make it harder for attackers, make them work harder to find all of those things that lead to them more easily finding that one thing that leads to my network compromise.
I think the biggest thing that I see when companies are doing this right, and the biggest thing that they can do well, is get the fundamentals right. What that does is not only getting the fundamentals right covers your assets, for a play on words there, but it covers your ability to have to manage and deal with all of the little problems that get solved once you start to do all the fundamentals, and that frees up time to then go and find and search and build programs to look for those anomalies and look for those one-off systems. If you're putting fires out all the time, or you're fighting ransomware, or you're dealing with users getting viruses on their machine because they're local admins, you don't have time to go and actually do the more advanced and sophisticated and kind of one-off things. You need to get to that point doing the fundamentals so that you can free up time, energy, and start to do the more advanced things.
It's interesting. It's a cliche thing to reduce our attack surface, but what I hear you saying is it's really about that, right? It's really about minimizing the things that you have to deal with, i.e. reducing your attack surface, so that those things that you're limiting the paths, so that when you do see a path, you can actually respond to it, and it's not just lost in the noise and response, and you're dealing with all this other, common malware and all this other stuff that is sucking up your time. Reducing your attack surface really lets you focus on, oh, hey, look, someone's trying to break into our network. Let's focus on that. While we know that all those other kind of easy ways that people would have, we know we got those locked down.
Yeah, and a lot of that comes down to testing, right? You do have to get some visibility into what those particularities are and where to prioritize, starting to do those fundamentals from someone that really understands what the fundamentals mean. But on top of that, really making sure that you are figuring out how to do your job with less resource, how to do your job with less work. And it really comes down to you getting to do more interesting work. You shouldn't have to be sitting there fighting ransomware and backing up an end user's computer because a home drive wasn't mapped properly. Like, those are things that technology has solved for a long time. So do the fundamentals and do them right. And that frees you up for a lot more interesting work that will progress not only your career, but make you look good on the network. If you don't have incidents that you have to deal with, and you're helping people with more interesting problems, that makes you look really good.
Dan, are you still there? Or
I am.
Oh, yeah, Dan, you're still there. So one of the things I was thinking about with Nmap, right, is I think from an external attack surface perspective, when I think about some of the barriers that we had many years ago, it was like, how do I stand up something that's completely external to my organization, scan all of my stuff that maybe I know about, or maybe I know about some of the ranges or most of the ranges in my IP address space, my DNS space, right? I know most of that stuff. Most organizations know most of that stuff. How do I automate that, bring it into a solution such as Plextrack, get people fixing that stuff, so then that, to Tyler's point, I can focus on looking for some more of that advanced stuff. I think what your platform kind of brings, coupled with now cloud computing, where it's super easy now for anyone to really go spin up any external infrastructure, spin up some basic tools, have those funnel into a platform where my operations people are fixing those things, and then I can spend more time focusing on stuff. I don't know, Dan, if you see people doing that, or if you thought about kind of that use case for your tool where I can get most of my external attack surface kind of mapped and people acting on those things so that I can focus on the more advanced stuff.
Yeah, I think you notice that just in general, the industry is continually moving towards what all can we automate, and how do we aggregate that data.
Right.
So you see that in the SIM space, right? Is like all the different log sources. How do we get? And you're right. While it's easier to spin up, and this is, I'll see what Tyler has to say about this. I mean, while it's easier to spin things up, I would say it's harder to know all of what surface you have.
Yes.
Right. And because the perimeter is effectively gone, right? And even like in a containerized environment, I mean, machines are only up for a certain amount of time, and they may only have an IP address for a week, right? Like the same asset, it's a container, it's up and it's down. So I would say that just in general, the ability to discover your surface has continued to get more complex, and that's why you need automation, and you need a thorough. I think this is the fundamental flaw I find with putting too much context from an external vendor's perspective. Like, you have this severe vulnerability, right? I mean, you can I think it's okay to give a context of it, but to still empower the team to really understand, like, oh, well, no, that's an internal server versus an external server. And so the blue team or the internal team really is responsible for understanding and trying to discover all of what exists in their environment.
It could be where purple teaming comes in, right? I mean, so if it's my enterprise, right, CISO or whatever, I want to have my internal team knowing about as much as they can. I want to engage an external pen testing team to tell me about, basically to that article's point, right, that drift, that 10, 20% roughly that maybe I don't know about, and then working as a purple team to operationalize that, right, to know that, hey, interface with my cloud computing environments that I know about, and when things spin up, I know about it, I scan it, I recognize that as my attack surface. Interfacing with DNS, if something gets a DNS record, internally, like, I know about that. I don't have to rely on an external thing to kind of brute force it. Like, internally, to kind of the purple teaming, like, I know what my DNS tables look like. I can feed that into something that's looking for all of that stuff and then scanning it as part of my attack surface.
Yeah, and I think you're actually right in terms of like purple teaming scoping, right? Is you should be doing we always emphasize putting smaller scope on engagements and doing them more frequent and more often. So, hey, this for this purple team engagement, we're going to just spend a week just all of us try to identify what our attack surface is, right? And maybe that's like the first one that you should do, right? But and then understand those techniques that the red team did, bring in other outside consultants or whatever to help you with that. In kind of an iterative fashion, but then the red team and the blue team both start to learn the context of their organization, what their attack surface is, and then you have a better idea of like where that drift might occur.
Right. Tyler, I got to imagine that the advanced security maturity organizations are doing that kind of stuff, right?
Most of them are, but you also, when you start to think about, not all, we've seen a few that are not this way, but when you start to think about advanced or very mature security organizations, you're talking about a lot of assets. And regardless of how good they are, they also have a ton to do because of all of the assets. If they have a large budget, that typically means that they have a large surface to cover as well. And that means also usually regionally or globally diverse workforce. And so there are many other interesting challenges that start to combat the security teams as they're starting to look for all these assets and categorize them and keep track of all of them. Whether they can get to them across the Great Firewall to their China office, or perhaps the firewall rules are different because the team that's managing the firewall in London doesn't do it the same way. Maybe there's not the same security scanner because of a merger and acquisition or picking up another company. So yes, most of the secure and mature organizations are doing this fairly well, and they have a pretty good idea of what's in their base or core network and devices. That doesn't always mean that they have a great handle on everything that is happening worldwide or to all their other assets.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Once you identify, let's just say, an asset, right? I want to go to my story number 17, the Hitchhiker's Guide to Web App Pen Testing, right? Because I think that in the context of what we're talking about, identifying your externally facing web assets is one thing. Understanding what's inside of those and what you can test is a totally different exercise. And Tyler, I was looking at the IoT device that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. I was just amazed as, okay, this is one external asset. Excuse me. When I lift up the covers on it, There's all kinds of stuff inside the app, and it's not even my app, right? Someone else's app, and all the different APIs, both internally, maybe in the browser, to talk about our next segment that's airing at the end of the show, right? That are inside of that. How do I figure out what all that is? How do I figure out what I need to test when I identify an asset? I thought this article was actually really good, and the title was very kind of like cliche, making a sci-fi reference and all that stuff. But I thought did a great job of, if you're going to assess a web app, you might need to go back and look at some of the fundamentals as to how applications are being developed today to truly get a complete picture as to what your application might be doing today. And just one of the things, they're linked to a Mozilla article, the Guide to Web APIs. When you open that, it's this whole list of all these APIs that interact with the browser and the DOM that any number of web applications could be accessing, that really speaks to also your attack surface, which I think is somewhat frightening in a way, as to how exposed we can be.
Yeah, I mean, new web applications, like web app testing today is becoming a completely different beast. You really have to understand not only cloud architecture APIs, but you also have to understand a lot of these new frameworks, backend Django servers and Kubernetes clusters that interface via an API call, and then tie and hook with some JavaScript on the client side that then put something in the DOM. Like, there's so many aspects, and you have to have so much visibility into each layer and each side of the communication that the web application testing is not as easy as it once was. Firing up some burp and hitting a server or a web URL. It's an entirely different process now.
Yeah, I feel like firing a burp, going after a web app is like just the start, right? And burp tells you about stuff that you need to investigate further. Was definitely my experience, and very different from even a web app test maybe 5 or 10 years ago.
And then you add in, like, all these web apps are now a mobile application that's just a web app communicating across some webhooks or a WebSocket. And so you're adding in the application layer. Can the Android app communicate differently than the iOS app based on sandboxing or security controls on the device? And then how do those API or WebSockets or hooks actually happen? And there's so much to this that it gets very very deep, and that doesn't even touch the surface of like the ad tracking or some of the libraries that get added in that are even not within inside of the client scope, but they're part of the client's application and could add security vulnerabilities to it.
I find doing web app tests today, I'm going back and like basically RTFM, right? Like, I'm reading the documentations as to how this stuff should work to understand where vulnerabilities may lie, which then leads me into how they might be attacked. And I want to give a shout out to, this was posted to Dark Reading Room. Vanessa Sauter was the author, and I thought Vanessa did a great job of giving us a lot of resources where basically we can go back to like step one and like understand how all this stuff worked. And I mean, the number of links to resources in this article is staggering, but it's one that you need to read if you're going to do any kind of web app testing today, especially in a bug bounty capacity or as a pen tester. Like, bookmark this article and go back and start working your way through all of the resources in here, because you're going to need all of those tools, right? Even if you just familiarize yourself to a point to know that this technology like does X, Y, Z and interacts in this way, the next time you come across that, at least you have, in my mind, enough knowledge to know how to ask the question, right? And that's what I loved about this article, is it gives you that information to read, consume it all, and go, oh, now I know what question to ask. Because like sometimes you come up against a web app and you're like, crap, I don't even know what question to ask right now. Like, I got to go back and read the docs before I know that, right? Yeah,
I mean, that goes back to that point of like, we have to know every technology, every backend. We don't get to focus on, hey, I'm just a .NET developer, or I know JavaScript and that's all I need to know. We have to know all of the applications and how they interact, and then all the network capabilities and how those interact. And the pre-recorded interview that we have, I think, for this show that we did earlier, is kind of a great entryway into like some of those things that you have to start to consider. And that's not even the new things that are coming down the pipe that we talked about on the show. I'm really starting to dig into what we were going over, and it's a dark dark rabbit hole.
Yeah, it's really to kind of tease the next segment, right? Applications that run natively on the OS are slowly going into the age of the dinosaurs, right? Like basically modern web applications are going to be built on top of the browser, and they're going to be web applications, and they're going to have access to everything eventually that a native application has access to. And that has some serious repercussions security-wise from multiple aspects. And
that's just a fad.
I wish it was, Jeff. I really, believe me, I wish it was, because it kind of begs the question, like, do you lock down your operating system or do you lock down your browser? Now I really think it's really both. And I think the resources available to lock down your browser are very limited versus the ones to lock down your operating system. But also some of the responsibility falls on the people who develop the application that runs inside your browser. And to me, that's
a good portion. I'm sorry, finish your thought.
It's just very scary thought to me.
Well, and even scarier is we've spent most of this show, if not this episode, if not the whole show, talking about how so many companies haven't figured out how to lock down the operating system,
right,
or to do it consistently,
right,
or without drift. And now we're, so I mean, we're to the point, I think, where and I'm overgeneralizing perhaps, but it seems like nobody can afford to do the kind of security that they need to do, even if they're relying on automation and more tools to do it for them. It just seems to be daunting. I mean,
and the thing I struggle with, Jeff, is like, who do you trust and where does the responsibility lie? Like, where does the responsibility lie in Microsoft providing operating system, in Google providing the browser, and XYZ company creating the web app? They all have some responsibility to security, and also as the user and the enterprise providing these technologies to the user also has an area of responsibility. Where does all that lie? That's the concerning thing.
You're going to start to see a shared security model flush itself out, right?
Big time.
Much like we have with AWS and GCP.
Yeah, it's more like the hot
Azure.
potato model of security.
Well, exactly. Scott has a great point, right? It's very similar to cloud computing. Whose responsibility is it?
Or would it be easier
it's a visual,
to put all
Johnny.
this into cloud computing?
We all point fingers at each other.
Centralize it all, inside of the cloud. And that's where the responsibility demarcation points are.
Potentially, yeah.
To your point, Paul, earlier today, I was lazy, so I just asked a silly IPv6 question on Twitter, because Joff was doing his talk today. And somebody commented that IPv6 is very commonly used in mobile devices. If you want to see yours, disconnect from your Wi-Fi and then ask Google what your IP address is.
Right. Yeah.
And I thought, I find that mildly disturbing that Google knows what my IP address is. But it's probably the easiest way to do it, but it's just disturbing all at the same time.
Absolutely.
Jeff, if anybody wants the IP address to your house, it's 127.0.0.1.
But what is that in IPv6? Because I updated to IPv6 earlier today.
Oh, like I should know this, right? Like there is a, well, there's a link. Anyway, Joff is the expert on that.
Yep.
There was a silly article. The F words are a hidden superpower. Apparently, if you use the F words, it can increase your pain threshold, which explains. Actually, my wife has the vocabulary of a sailor most of the time.
Only around you, probably.
Yeah, usually.
Or in respect to you.
And she did break her ankle, like really. Actually, the worst way you could break your ankle is how she broke her ankle last summer. And I was just amazed. We have 3 kids, right? I was there for all 3 births, right? Obviously, I can't verbalize how painful that is. But when I saw her break her ankle, I was like, this seems like the worst pain you've ever been in. I'm not just saying, and I didn't say this while she was in it. This was like after the fact, and she's like, yeah, no, legit. I would much rather have like given birth to a child than go through that pain. And she used a lot of curse words through that whole process. And it turns out there's a scientific study that it's theoretically proven that it can increase your pain threshold. So this organization did a study in 2009. Obviously nothing new. That 67 study participants who were college students, ironically enough, I don't know why they chose just college students. I would have diversified my, pool of study people in this study, but they immersed their hands in ice water and then instructed to either swear repeatedly using profanity of their choice or chant in a neutral word. Lo and behold, the participants that said they experienced less pain were the ones that swore more versus the kind of, trance-like chanting kind of thing. For whatever that's worth.
IPv6. What? Sorry.
I don't know what that has to do with. It has nothing to do with security. I just thought it was an interesting article. Happened to come through in the security feeds. Kind of interesting.
I'm more curious.
If our network is really insecure and we curse a lot, does that make it better? I don't know.
It makes it better. Curse at your network. Why now? Other than it's a slow news season.
This week was better than last week, though, Jeff.
Yeah, but why write an article about an 11-year-old study unless you've got some reason to bring it up? I'm not seeing the reason to bring it up, but maybe it's in there somewhere. Whatever. It was a fun diversion.
How about story number 3? Not to draw any controversy.
So, hospital busting hacker crew may be behind some ransomware attack that made Honda halt car factories, says researchers.
No, that was my.
No, is that not my story? A different story.
That's my 6, but we can go with Honda.
Tyler's 3.
Oh, Tyler's 3. Sorry, Tyler's story number 3. What is your story number 3, Tyler? I'm clicking on it.
So.
Oh yeah, Firefox said Cisco had something to do with this too, right?
So I'm not sure. That particular article doesn't allude to which cybersecurity firm developed the 0-day, but it was a joint operation by FBI in conjunction with Facebook to develop a 0-day in order to target a sexual predator. Now the problem, and there's a whole outrage kind of around this, the private company helping a government entity in order to commit a crime against a U.S.
Tyler, was this CVE 2021? Was this CVE 2020-12405?
No, this is an
different.
Undisclosed 0-day.
Okay.
It's still not known. Yeah, so this 0-day that was developed was used to apprehend a child predator that was doing stuff on Facebook. This guy's the worst of the worst. I'm going to go bomb your school if you don't send me nudes, to young kids. So really, really bad stuff. So the FBI contacted Facebook, and I guess they collaborated with a cybersecurity firm to develop 0-day to get this guy's actual IP address via a flaw in Tails video player.
Well, that implies hacking back, Tyler, which is a totally different segment, right? That's still a really.
I think people should start thinking about.
Right, it's still a really controversial. John Strain and I did a lot of evangelism about the whole hacking back thing, right? We did talk about, and what I'll come down to is having a warrant. Collaborating with law enforcement with a warrant, right? There's also privacy laws that come into play, and also laws on the books in different countries, like the CFAA here in the U.S., you have to comply with. If you violate the CFAA, you're just as much as a criminal as the person hacking you, right? If you're collaborating with law enforcement, very much need a warrant that's blessed by a judge at some point. So there's some fine lines in there. I'm hoping in this story, right, they followed all those guidelines, right? They had a warrant that was blessed by a judge, therefore they were able to do this. The fact they're using a 0-day exploit is a really kind of wrinkle in the story as well.
it sets an interesting precedence, right? Like a private company and a government entity working together in order to have a 0-day to target a U.S. person. Yeah, they had all the warrants in place, and I think that's great. They went above and beyond, like the law. They have to follow that to a T. A big organization like that, the FBI is very, very by the books. The thing that I think people didn't consider as they were, everyone's getting mad about this, like, yeah, this sets bad precedents. I think there has to be extraordinary circumstances, and there has to be a gray place for things like this, where it is a heinous and sexual predators are one of those things that I think there needs to be even more gray area that people can, in conjunction with law enforcement, work to do these kind of things. And that is definitely not the we'll say the appropriate viewpoint in most people's eyes. They think this is just setting bad precedent and freedoms are at risk.
But precedent, laws, all that stuff, and judge, if you have evidence, right? Okay, you used a 0-day exploit, right? You had evidence that was presented before a judge. I mean, that's how we base things here in the U.S., right? Like, at some level, we have to be able to go after bad people, right?
One would think so, but you have to remember that you're setting the precedence for attack back.
Well, I agree. Precedence is a scary thing, Scott, and you bring up a great point, right? Like, in this case, you had the evidence, but now does that set precedent, and how is that upheld moving forward? I agree. You don't want to violate laws or privacy moving forward based on precedent set on, kind of this extraneous case. It's a fine line. I agree.
Well, on one hand, you've got Facebook, we clean, right? But also Facebook, we think you're really bad. We're going to hack your shit.
Right. Right. Well, also on the flip side,
and how they did it was just so trivial. Like I was sitting there reading this damn article, and I'm like, how does somebody fall for? Hey, I'm going to send you something on Dropbox. You have to download it.
Oh, we'll talk after the show, dude. Criminals sometimes are not all that smart. Just to be
I'll tell you, this guy had been hunted for quite a while, and his OPSEC was pretty good, and he has taken extreme measures. I mean, he was operating out of tails, right? Like, so he wasn't dumb, and that was kind of part of the extortion path, right? Like he forced them to SMS or upload videos of themselves doing things so that they didn't get extorted. And so the length to which it took for the FBI and Facebook to get to the point where they had to go and do it and hire someone for 6 figures to write a 0-day, that was quite a ways. And this is one of those things where I think this is an interesting kind of...
Wait, hold on. They hired someone for 6 figures to write a 0-day to catch this person?
Yes. I mean, that tells you, if you read how bad this guy was, like, I think we need to have that pointing into the spear, that people realize that at some point justice has to be done, and that often requires writing a gray line. They went and did all the T's and dotted all the I's for everything they could do with inside of the bounds, and then it was time to get a little dirty. And I think there's not enough places or not enough people, because they're scared of like the freedoms and impinging that we're not targeting some of these people that are really heinous. Yeah, there are times in the government when we have to go target a nation state, and that means offing someone or making sure that someone talks it through extraordinary measures to save lives.
Disrupting centrifuges like the poster over your back shoulder, Tyler.
We know nothing about that.
No, but we do think about that, Scott. We do think about that. But I think the thing we have to come back to is abiding by the law, following the due process that we have in this country, and still being able to get the bad person, right? Sometimes that needs to happen. Sometimes that's not a bad person. Sometimes it's a bad bunch of people in a country. Sometimes it's a bad person abusing Facebook. And let's be frank, the stuff that I see, and I'm sure all the rest of you do as well, that gets posted on Facebook, that even the laws of, or the Facebook laws that exist, sometimes I appreciate, like, well, you're totally violating Facebook policy and standards and getting away with it. Like, I can't wait to see how long it takes for you to get caught and get banned from Facebook and get put in Facebook jail. But like there are things that I find on Facebook that I'm like, this should never exist in a very public social media outlet, but they do. And I'm like, I really hope that there's a limited amount of time that this can exist. But I see some of that stuff, and I'm like, really sometimes monitor it, just see how long it goes on in hopes so that we can.
Facebook does a good job for things that are blatantly criminal and things that have been going on for a while. They have a lot of things they're tracking on the radar, and just because it hasn't been taken down yet.
But YouTube is the same. YouTube is the same way, right? Google and Facebook both have this problem. I think kind of unique in terms of large companies that have this problem at scale. And I think we can all kind of appreciate like the task that they have at hand to basically police this kind of stuff, right?
Well, you talk about policing, and I've got two comments for you. One, do you want to get thunderstruck? Because this is how you get thunderstruck, right? And then two, the tales coming out of the tales coming from the people that have done content monitoring for Facebook are jaw-dropping.
Oh yeah, and YouTube too. The content monitoring they have to do, right, is just astonishing. And the fact they've done such a good job up to this point is actually pretty amazing, right?
Well, it begs to wonder the working conditions.
Yeah, who there are actual people that are policing this content, right?
Yeah,
very similar to government agencies that are policing this content. Yeah,
it's the same level of PTSD that police officers and firefighters get when they're responding to accidents.
Oh, I completely agree. Because we all know people who have worked for the government and have been on the child pornography teams, right? And have to police this stuff as well. Police in a generic sense of the word, right? Very much PTSD. Agree.
Yeah, and the really sad part is. Amanda Berlin, I'm going to call her out point blank, and I'm going to say that Amanda leading the charge with the mental health hackers is doing one of the best things that we can ever take part in as part of this community with the dumb shit that we have to deal with on a daily basis, right? Just to keep our own freaking sanity. Unfortunately, when you're looking at the conditions that these people have agreed to work in, they're not offered counseling. They're not offered time off to let their brain
But that's, I give props to Chris Hadnagi in the Innocent Lives Foundation, right? Where if you can create an organization like that, have a rotation that assists law enforcement, I think that's a great thing as well.
Yeah.
I think that's a great thing. I also think there needs to be more people. If you've never checked out
the Chris's organization, definitely do it.
Absolutely. Tyler?
Yeah, Innocent Lives Foundation is great. I think there does need to be a bigger visibility and more funding devoted to this sort of thing that puts a pointy end of the spear to be quicker at actionable intelligence. A lot of this intelligence that's gathered, a lot of these foundations have to operate with inside of the legal ramifications and the legal law. Yep. And so therefore that doesn't allow them to do much more than prepare a packet for law enforcement that is already overwhelmed with other cases and other things to do. And so there needs to be more emphasis put on this and more resources put on this that allows someone to be prosecuted and have a pointy end of the spear to go deal with the stuff that does need action immediately. Because there's a lot of intel that does get provided that just goes stale after a certain amount of time.
Totally.
It's Paul. It's almost like we need to bring in a cyber lawyer and have a really big point counterpoint hardcore discussion on not only what Facebook has done, right, but also how it's viewed across the legal system, and then the ramifications down the road and what those ramifications could tailspin into.
Oh, yeah, totally agree.
Our lawyer's been diving into this for a couple days now. She's been writing an article for Above the Law for it.
Yeah, interesting situation. Any other articles you folks want to talk about before we conclude?
Now let's call it.
That will conclude the security news for this week. Stay tuned with our conversation with Ben from Acunetics. Coming up next, talking about browser APIs, not to be missed. Stay tuned.